This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 238 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the NumberFire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. As a lot of you know, I'm not much of a rankings guy. Fantasy football shouldn't be played in some linear fashion, and that's what rankings tell us. They tell us that this guy is one spot better than this next guy, who's one spot better than this next guy. Making tiers makes a lot more sense to me, but even still, when you're married to a list, you're not going to be as flexible with strategy and reacting to what's going on during your draft. That's why rankings don't really do it for me. But I do understand why they're helpful. Not everyone is looking at the game the way that some of us degenerates are. And to be completely honest, rankings make for good content. Even if I don't strictly follow my rankings during a draft, those same rankings are telling. They tell me which players I generally like more than others. And if you're consuming the rankings yourself, they're telling you that exact same thing. So on today's show, I'm going to talk about rookie rankings. I'll be providing my top 10 wide receivers entering the draft to go along with my top 5 running backs. I decided against doing one comprehensive list for today's show because things are going to change a lot after this weekend's draft. More than what we've seen in previous seasons because of the lack of true studs. And I'm only going to talk about 5 running backs because I can't even remember a running back draft class where landing spot mattered this much. Landing spot means a ton for running backs in general, but this year, it's that times 50. Now, before looking at the rankings, I wanted to let you guys know that with the NBA playoffs underway, FanDuel is offering you a free shot at 2 tickets to the NBA Finals. Every night of the playoffs from now until May 14th, they'll run a free qualifier with $1,000 in prizes. If you win, you will then advance to another contest at the end of the playoffs where you can win a share of $20,000 in prizes and 2 tickets to the finals. For more information on the NBA Fantasy Playoffs, visit FanDuel.com or download the app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. I'd rather end the show with wide receivers because it's a better wide receiver class than a running back one, so let's start today's show with running backs. At the top of my running back rankings is Josh Jacobs. He most definitely does not rank at the top within my prospect model, let me be clear. But my prospect model really doesn't love any of the running backs in this year's class. Just to give you some context, the model dates back to 2006, so I have every relevant running back since that time in my database. The top running back in this year's class, according to the model, is David Montgomery. If we assume that Montgomery goes in like the 3rd or the 4th round, he'll rank 70th to 75th overall at running back since 2006. That's not good for a top running back in the class. I've talked about this a lot on the show, but I use the model to help spot outliers and find players that I'll be higher and lower on versus the public. And it served me well, so come at me, haters. But let's get back to Jacobs. It's really hard to be in love with him, at least in my opinion, as someone who largely prospects through data. There have been 29 first-round running backs drafted since 2006. Let's just assume that Jacobs goes in round 1. That would make 30. When looking at final season production among those running backs, Jacobs ranks dead last in attempts per game, dead last in attempt share, and easily dead last in rushing yards per game. You can say that those things don't matter, but when looking at successful running backs in the NFL, they've mattered historically. If Josh Jacobs ends up being a fantasy producer, he'll be an outlier. So you may be wondering why I'm counting on an outlier. If Jacobs is my RB1, that means I'm saying I'm hoping an outlier happens. And the main reason is because I'm unsure that any running back will have predictable value at the next level in fantasy football in this class. I'm also willing to bet that after the draft is over and we see landing spots, that I'll bump Josh Jacobs down on this list even if he has the best draft equity. But for right now, assuming no other back that I like goes to a place where he can thrive, Jacobs is my RB1. There's still something to be said about how many scouts seem to love him. At the number 2 spot, I don't have David Montgomery, actually. I know that I mentioned that he's favored in my model, but it's not like he's looked at as this can't-miss prospect. So as a result, I'd rather go for a player who has a better athletic build and one who still has a strong enough production profile. And that's Miles Sanders. He gets dinged because he only has 1 real year of production, but at least we know why that's the case. He played behind Saquon Barkley. But during his final season and relative to the other backs in this class, Sanders was above average in attempts per game, attempt share, and rushing yards per game. But then he was a good receiver. He had a top 5 reception share in this class, and that's something that I always look for in a running back prospect. Even if they're not a receiver on the next level, it shows that their team wanted to use them in a lot of different ways because they're good. So the athletic ability combined with good enough rushing production and good receiving production makes him my number 2 back. If he lands in a good spot, he will be the number one back in this class in my post-draft rankings. I've then got David Montgomery at 3. Now, Montgomery's a well-rounded back without a ton of bad marks in his production profile, but I do worry about his lack of burst and how that translates to the next level. The other day, my buddy Rich Rebar said it best about Montgomery. He said that Montgomery is one of those guys who's going to be volume dependent for 2 or 3 years and then just sort of disappear. That's sort of the profile that he has. And my comp for Montgomery is Noshan Moreno, who is basically that. I do think Montgomery is good at breaking tackles. He's probably the best in this class at doing so, but I just have worries that he's just a little bit decent at everything, and that won't allow him to stand out at the next level. Now, I considered putting Darrell Henderson at RB3, but he's 4th on this list pre-draft. He's another player who has the potential to rise a whole lot in the right spot, but there are some data-driven concerns with his profile. Now, efficiency isn't a problem for Darrell Henderson. He averaged almost 9 yards per carry during his final 2 seasons at Memphis. But I feel like it would be a little bit disingenuous if I decided to put a ton of stock into that for only Henderson, when what I've researched has told me that yards per carry doesn't really matter when prospecting. I think that since his numbers are that good and that insane, we have to take notice. We have to realize that Darrell Henderson might be special because of that. But he still has some holes in the volume department, which makes him a little less stable of a prospect. And I wonder if he's going to be capable of being a high volume NFL back. Now, another player that my model really likes within the context of this class is Travion Williams. He's my number 5 back, which is really high compared to the consensus. Some of this ranking has to do with the fact that the class is so weak, so even this RB5 ranking just doesn't have a lot of juice. It doesn't really matter. But I also want to throw a player out there that I seem to be a lot higher on, so let's just roll with Travion Williams. The size concerns are definitely there for Williams. He's 5'8", 206 pounds. But his college production was out of control good, and he came through with a pretty average to potentially above average athletic profile. At least his speed score was above average. I think he'll be used a lot as a satellite back at the next level, but maybe he'll end up providing more. I sort of like players like him who can find the field with a pass catching and pass blocking skill set and then have some room to grow into a bigger role. So I'm going to have him at RB5 partially for fun, but also because I think that he's being wildly undervalued right now. But that's enough with running backs. It's a really uninspiring class, and that's not the case for wide receiver. So let's dig into that position. If you've been listening to these offseason podcasts, then you know that my favorite wideout entering the draft is N'Keal Harry. I understand the film takes that he often lacks separation. I understand those concerns. I also can't ignore the unbelievable production profile he put together at Arizona State. He basically produced right away in college, but his sophomore and junior seasons, so his final 2 years, he posted pretty elite market share numbers across the board. Within the context of this class, among Power 5 conference players, Harry's final collegiate season saw him with the 3rd best receiving yard share, the 5th best reception share, and the 2nd best touchdown share. And he essentially hit those same market share marks during his sophomore season too. That combined with an elite breakout age makes him analytically a really good prospect. Now, I've gotten the question of whether or not DJ Moore, who I had as the top receiver last year, would be the top receiver this year. My model actually says that yes, DJ Moore is the better prospect compared to N'Keal Harry, and I agree with that. But Harry has one of those production profiles that you can feel confident about even with some of those concerns about his separation. Because at the very least, he can play the big slot role. He can be a Marquise Colston type player, especially in the right spot. But I think that he's going to be more than that. The top 3 wide receivers in my rankings are almost interchangeable though. Number 2 is A.J. Brown and number 3 is Hakeem Butler. I do like Harry more right now, but if one of those 2 wide receivers ends up in the right spot, I'll have no problem bumping them ahead of Harry. But let's start with A.J. Brown. Josh Norris made the point with A.J. Brown on last week's show that he showed that he can play all over the field when DK Metcalf went down for Ole Miss last year. I think some are sort of forcing Brown into being a slot receiver at the next level, but he's more than that. And if you like DK Metcalf, you have to ask yourself how and why A.J. Brown was able to outproduce DK Metcalf in college. Because he did. Now, experience may have played some sort of a role there, but Brown is a far more polished receiver with a better production profile coming out than Metcalf is. And because of his versatility and his size, I understand why Brown's being comped to Juju Smith-Schuster. I think that's sort of his ceiling. So he's in my 2 spot right now. And like I said, Hakeem Butler's in the 3 spot. The biggest knock on his production profile is that he really didn't produce until his final collegiate season, so in 2018 when he was a junior. But guys, breakout age isn't everything. It's a piece of the puzzle that matters a good bit, but what also matters a good bit is how a player performs during his final collegiate season, more than other seasons. That final season is really important. And during 2018, Butler had 42% of his team's receiving yards and 45% of his team's touchdowns. He's the only player from a Power 5 school to do that last year. And I looked back within my database and searched for players who hit those 2 marks during their final seasons. And the list is pretty amazing, especially when you filter out players who didn't have good draft equity. You get Calvin Johnson, Amari Cooper, Corey Davis, Demaryius Thomas, Des Bryant, DJ Moore, Hakeem Nicks, AJ Jenkins, Jordy Nelson, Jordan Matthews, Stephen Hill, Paul Richardson, and Greg Jennings as top 100 picks who hit those marks. That's a crazy good hit rate. He's got the size and the speed, and he's not just a possession receiver either. According to PFF, no player had more deep ball receptions last year than Hakeem Butler. He's really got a lot of potential at the next level. Now, after those 3, I've got a pretty big dip to the next receiver. I think that you can make the case for a lot of guys at number 4. But I'm going to take somewhat of a different route than most, and I'm going to go with Andy Isabella. According to Pro Football Focus, no player had a better yards per route run rate than Andy Isabella had last year. And everyone sort of typecast Isabella as a slot guy, but he played on the outside at UMass too. About 70% of his receptions came from outside the slot last year. And it's really easy to argue that he's got the most complete production profile in this class. Now, part of that is because he went to UMass, but you don't post the type of numbers that Isabella posted unless you're good. UMass isn't like Malone University. And that list that I just shared regarding the thresholds that Hakeem Butler hit, Andy Isabella hit them too. We just don't know if he'll be a top 100 pick. He should be, though. He ran a 4.31 40, which was necessary given his smaller frame. But that combined with his production profile makes him a really similar prospect to Brandon Cooks. I think Isabella has the potential to make that type of impact. Maybe it'll end up being felt on the actual football field more than the fantasy one, but I think Isabella is a really, really good prospect. Now at 5, I've got JJ Arcega-Whiteside. He was an absolute monster in the red zone in college, and his 48.3% receiving touchdown share was first among Power 5 receivers in this year's class. He would literally box out defenders in the red zone. He's 6'2", 225 pounds, so he's got a good frame, and his dominator rating, according to Player Profiler, ranks in the 86th percentile. I could see him going to a place like San Francisco and really thriving. So I've got JJ Arcega-Whiteside 5th. The wideout I think will be first off the board in the real NFL draft is Marquise Hollywood Brown, and that's who comes in at number 6. If you recall my conversation with Anthony Amico about a month ago on prospecting through data, one metric that he talked about was receiving yards per team attempt. It's sort of an interesting way of capturing market share and efficiency. Now, according to that metric, which helped both Anthony's model and my model this year, the top 3 players in receiving yards per team attempt in this year's class are Andy Isabella, Hakeem Butler, and Hollywood Brown. The biggest issue with Brown is his size and the foot injury that sidelined him from doing drills at the combine. He weighed in at only 166 pounds, and that's a problem. That weight is a problem. We haven't seen a 1,000-yard receiver at that weight since 1991. Maybe that won't be his playing weight, though. And that's where the Deshaun Jackson-like potential comes into play. Hollywood's a big play receiver, and he'd be an absolute perfect fit for a team like the Chiefs. Maybe the Chiefs go that route given the issues surrounding Tyreek Hill right now. But I could also see the Eagles wanting to take a shot to actually learn behind Deshaun Jackson himself. But Brown actually has a pretty good production profile. If we had fewer question marks about his size, he'd be higher on this list. So I guess by now you may be wondering where the hell DK Metcalf is. He's the top receiver on a lot of draft boards, but I haven't talked about him yet. Well, he comes in at number 7. Like I said, I think that you can make the argument for a lot of guys at number 4, or where Andy Isabella was ranked. Metcalf is one of those guys. But as I noted on last week's mailbag show, I think we sometimes mistake upside with, we just don't know a whole lot about this player. And that's kind of where I'm at and others are at with DK Metcalf. Could he turn into something significant in the NFL? Sure. Should we feel confident about that? Not necessarily. He's got the physical tools, but we didn't see much versatility from him in college. And his agility drill scores were scary as hell. Now, I said this a while back on the show, but if you want his upside comparison, it would probably be Andre Johnson. You got decent college production, great efficiency, and insane physical tools. That's like total upside, though. And Andre Johnson actually scored well in the agility drills. I think a more reasonable comp is like a thicker Martavis Bryant. I just worry about his ability to be a complete receiver given what we're working off of. But I do completely recognize that with the right situation and coaching, DK Metcalf could be a star. I'm just not banking on that right now. At number 8, I've basically got a cheaper version of DK Metcalf, and that's Miles Boykin. When I'm prospecting wide receivers, I'm giving the most shits about college production. And Boykin doesn't really have that. He saw 26% of Notre Dame's receiving yards during his final year, and he had just 22% of their receptions, and he scored about 35% of their touchdowns. Now, for some perspective, I did that one study earlier this offseason where I looked at successful wide receivers in fantasy and showed that their college production profiles were generally elite. Among the successful NFL fantasy stars over the last 7 or so years, when in college, those players averaged over a 31% reception share during their final season, a 36% receiving yard share, and a 43% touchdown share. So essentially, Boykin doesn't fit that mold. But a lot of players won't, considering we're looking at really good wide receivers in the NFL. Film grinders who are better at watching this stuff than I am seem to really like Boykin, and his athletic profile is incredibly strong. He's a freak. And it's not as though his production is horrific. It's not great, but it's not bad. So all of that combined sort of screams at you and tells you that he's just sort of a raw prospect. And that's why I think he's just a cheaper DK Metcalf. He's got the physical tools without the name recognition. And in the right spot, he could dominate. So there's a chance that he falls a lot on this list post-draft, but he could also be a big riser too. One of the safer bets in this year's draft at wide receiver, I think, is Deebo Samuel. There's nothing overly special about his production profile to say that he's a can't-miss prospect, but he does rank close to the top 10 according to my model. He tested athletically really well, and when you watch him, he's just a bulldozer with the ball in his hands. He's not unlike a Golden Tate or a DJ Moore type player from a play style standpoint. I think he'll play in the slot mostly at the next level, and I would love to see him go to a place like Green Bay. Samuel would bring a Randall Cobb element back to the Packers immediately. Now, last but not least, at number 10, I've got Paris Campbell. Some have Campbell a lot higher than 10, and I can understand it to a degree. He's a fringe top 10 guy in my model, but he had arguably the best combine of any wide receiver in this class. Here's what worries me. He's one of those hybrid players who was used in a very specific way in college. Campbell has 4.3 speed, but according to PFF, only 21 of his 111 targets last year came 10 or more yards down the field. He caught just 2 deep ball passes last year. So you can say, oh, it's just how they used him, and that wouldn't be wrong. But that also doesn't tell us that he can be more than this gimmicky type player. So with my ranking, I'm sort of splitting the difference. Honestly, I think the easy comp for him is just go with another Ohio State receiver in Curtis Samuel. And there's nothing wrong with Curtis Samuel. He's not a bad player. I just don't know that volume will be there for that type of player at the next level, and we know volume is what drives fantasy football. So those are my rankings. To recap, at running back, I've got Josh Jacobs, Miles Sanders, David Montgomery, Darrell Henderson, and Travion Williams. At wideout, it's N'Keal Harry, A.J. Brown, Hakeem Butler, Andy Isabella, J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, Hollywood Brown, DK Metcalf, Miles Boykin, Deebo Samuel, and Paris Campbell. I'm sure those rankings will be blown up post-draft, but I did want to share my thoughts on some of these guys before that time comes. That's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, Stitcher, and Spotify. And if you're on iTunes, please do me a favor and leave a rating and review. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week.